Morning, everyone. Feels nice to be on the second day of the conference. Yeah? Yeah. Cool. So I'm Manoj Kumar. So I'm a Selenium committer, predominantly working on the documentation team for the Selenium HQ. So if you see any mistakes on the docs on the HQ page, so that's me, let me. And also we are working on the new docs, and you're very much welcome to send in some pull requests to the repository. And apart from that, I do contribute a lot to the other tools, namely Protractor, ng WebDriver, Thucydides. So Thucydides is actually Serenity now. And then a couple of pull requests to that. And now I'm going to talk about the WebDriverJS. How many of you here use WebDriver JavaScript? Cool. It's nice to know. So I'm going to talk about the official Node.js bindings for WebDriver. There's a lot of other third-party tools available in the market, but just making sure you follow what I'm going to talk about. It's going to be the WebDriverJS. First of all, I'd like to thank Jason Leba. So he's the official maintainer of the Node.js bindings for JavaScript. So he's the person who's single-handedly doing it, and I've just started helping him with a couple of pull requests to him. So a huge round of applause for him, please. Cheers, thank you. So WebDriverJS, right? So WebDriver JavaScript was not available straight away when it compares to the other bindings like Java, C#, Ruby, and Python. We started a little late, and I think the other projects like WebDriverJS, and then it became WebDriver.io, I believe. We took a while to get onto it, so it has been around since summer 2009, and it was first added to NPM with the version 2.29.0. So it took a while for us to get onto NPM for people to use it, but we were working on the couple of changes and make sure it's stabilized, and we were working on a lot of changes that we did as part of the Promise Manager. Yeah? Cool. Some numbers before we actually get on to the actual talk. So it's estimated that we have around total 12 million downloads, which is by far the highest when you compare to all other JavaScript bindings that we have. So I just did my numbers yesterday. If you look at March 4th, 2016 to March 4th, 2017, we have around 12 million downloads. We're averaging around 1 million of downloads per month. So it's pretty good to know, and JavaScript is evolving, right? Cool. So yeah, I asked this question, but I'll ask again. So how many use JavaScript for testing? Good. So out of these, I think at least half of them use the official bindings for WebDriver, right? Yeah, cool. I know, using JavaScript. So how many of you ran into a situation where you speak with your colleagues and say, I use JavaScript, and they give you a hug? Well, I did a lot of that. I was using JavaScript, and I got into a situation, I was like, you dog, you use JavaScript for testing? You put a lot of callbacks, right? Yeah. But, yes, I know, funny. JavaScript is awesome, right? Why? Because it's making a tremendous improvement in the programming paradigm, so introducing the functional programming paradigm, right? So it's not exactly a proper 100% functional programming language, but it does has a lot of libraries, a lot of APIs that you can use to achieve a functional programming. And it is following the FDD. It could be called as a functional driven development, but I'm gonna pull Simon. You know what? Simon says JavaScript is fashion driven development. I know for some reasons, but it also kind of sucks, right? For some reasons. The asynchronous nature of language with JavaScript is also its Achilles heel. So Achilles heel is nothing but, in spite of the overall strength, which can lead to the downfall, right? So coming into the actual talk, let me give a brief on how is it going to be before moving on to the slides. So the slides are made around in different sections that I'm going to introduce about how the WebDriver JavaScript is different from other bindings, and then a little bit about what makes JavaScript special and how do we solve the asynchronous stuff, and a little bit about the promise manager, and how do we write tests moving forward, which might help you as a key takeaway from this talk, and also covering a little bit on the third-party libraries that's been built around the official WebDriver bindings. So how is it different? So what makes the Node.js WebDriver bindings different with other WebDriver language bindings? It's nothing but the asynchronous, right? So asynchronous in the programming computing world is nothing but it doesn't wait for your sequential actions to be done. So when you have a sequence of tasks which you execute, it doesn't wait for the first task to be done. It could actually start the second and third parallelly, right? The main difference is the WebDriver's JavaScript API is entirely asynchronous, and every command results in a promise. So it might be quite confusing if you're not using WebDriver, but it's all about promises. I'll just give a slight demo on the async behavior. So I just have a dirty example. I didn't quite follow what Simon said yesterday on his keynote, having a logging statement at each level of your API. So it's actually not on the screen. All right, I'm not sure how do we get onto the main screen. Yep, I did. Yeah, here it is. Yep. All right, that's not the one, but I'll get on talking. So what happens with asynchronous is, right, so when you, yeah, that's the one. So I'm importing the WebDriver, Selenium WebDriver library with a global timeout, and I'm having a const driver where I'm building the new WebDriver instance, and that's the dirty step that I was telling about. So I'm having a log statements at each and every API call, and this is how it creates problem, right? So what happens when you run this test is that you can actually see all the console log statements spreading up beforehand when you actually get onto the driver.get. So before even opening up the browser window, on the console window, if you see, you will have step 1, step 2, step 3, and even the test completed. So that's the problem with asynchronous. So you're not seeing the same problem with the driver.find element. Why? Because under the hood, it uses the promise manager, and it does all the sweet things for you. So that's the problem with the asynchronous stuff that we were talking about. Now getting onto it, how do we solve asynchronous? So callback pattern, right? It's quite famous, and everyone in the JavaScript world will quite know about what callback pattern is. And it's nothing but continuous parsing or the pyramid of doom. So even for such a small example, you will end up writing a lot of nested function callbacks. So that's the original image that I was referring to earlier. You saw that, right? putting callbacks and callbacks. So that's exactly this one. If you look at driver.get google.com and then a function which is eventually returning a function for driver.findElement. And this is generally avoided in the JavaScript world, which is not we are going to follow as well. So what's the next way to solve asynchronous promises? So what is a promise? The simplest explanation that can be given is nothing but it can be avoided using writing the pyramid of doom. So next thing is promise chaining. So instead of using a callback pattern, you can actually chain the promises wherein it will help you solve the asynchronous problem. So when I mean asynchronous problem, it's nothing but you're desyncing the process so that it will help you in achieving the steps sequentially. So if you see promise chain is nothing but the thenable statements. So you have driver.get google.com and then .then of a function. So this is nothing, it's written on ES6 JavaScript. So you have the big fat arrow which returns the function, which is also quite verbose. It is also not very much recommended to use because this is quite simple for a small example, but when your tests eventually get longer, you will have tough time maintaining all this, and it is also a problem when you try to debug some issues. Next. So how we let users to use WebDriverJS without all this fuss, right? So WebDriverJS is built on Promise Manager and managed by a control flow. So Promise Manager helps us to write tests in JavaScript like any other synchronous bindings like Java, C#, Ruby, and Python. It maintains a queue of scheduled tasks and execute them in order, right? And then with control flow. So control flow is based on the concept of tasks and queues. So it maintains a series of tasks as you execute, right? So you have all your WebDriver APIs like driver.findElement and then a couple of steps based on your application. And what it does is it adds a lot of tasks to the queue itself and it executes on a JavaScript event loop. That I'll get onto it later on the next slide. I'll put it into a small diagram. So this is how it looks. So a task is nothing but that define a basic unit of work for the control flow to execute, wherein you can see you have all the queue up and the down, and then it stacks up and executes. So this is how the task queue works. So yeah, so the core engine on the Promise Manager that works is based on the control flow, which is eventually a JavaScript event loop. If you ask me how the event loop looks, which is actually, if you want to talk about the JavaScript event loop, it will be in another, you can actually talk a day about it, but in short, what it does is while queue.wait for message, it will process the next message, right? This is how the event loop works. So I'm not going to get into detail about it. That's not a part of this talk, but just to give an idea about how the control flow works. So that's it. And so with WebDriverJS, along with Promise Manager, we allowed people to write WebDriver code which is just like Java code, right? Does it look similar? Yeah. So instead of writing tests like this, which looks ugly with a lot of thenable statements and with a lot of ES6 arrows. Now, we talked a lot about Promise Manager and the asynchronous stuff, why we had this Promise Manager, right? So now let's look at some of the downfalls for Promise Manager. So we are actually having 3,300 lines of code for Promise Manager. Imagine, right? So it's so tough to maintain, and that's why we are actually going to deprecate it, right? It's going to be such surprising noise. You can actually look into the issue in GitHub 2969. It means that we have quite a few documentation on why we are deprecating it, and that's what we're going to see now. And before that, We also have problems like it is difficult to debug. So for those of you who use the official WebDriver bindings, you will actually get into a problem when you debug your test. You will get into a problem, and also it was not quite agnostic. So what we actually did within WebDriverJS is that we allowed a testing module inside the WebDriverJS, wherein we wrapped the Mocha unit test framework, and people actually used test.describe and test.it instead of directly using Mocha, which used to be describe and it blocks in the spec file, right? So that was not agnostic when you extend the framework, when you actually use along with some other third-party libraries like parallel Mocha test. So I quite used the parallel Mocha test, but had problems with it, which I was suspecting due to the testing wrapper that we did along with Mocha.js. And as I discussed, it's difficult to debug. So deprecating promise manager, what? It could be surprising. So yeah. We saw promise manager is helping people to write synchronous code, right? Which is just look like Java. Now, why we are deprecating? It might be surprise news, and if you follow GitHub issues regularly, then I'm sure you would have seen this already, which is part of 2969. It's not that we are lazy and we're removing the 3,300 lines of code, but it's just that we are removing it in a favor of native language constructs. JavaScript language continues to evolve with more support for asynchronous programming and promises in particular, right? So it could be frustrating for JavaScript developers that a lot of version comes through like ES5, ES6, and now ES7. And if you look at the ECMA standard spec, it is evolving with a lot of spec. So even with WebDriver, right? So we are moving into W3 spec, which is betterment for the tool itself, right? So likewise, the JavaScript, it's moving towards a more the so-called programming language. I know this could be debatable, but it's somewhere near where it could be called as a programming language, where you have tools like WebAssembly, which you can actually have a compiler itself on a browser. So the tool is actually evolving in which you can actually use it far wider. And also with the front-end development, right? If you take in particular with JavaScript, we had AngularJS from Google as a front end, and now we have Facebook, people developing the Instagram with React.js, right? So we have a lot of people developing a single page applications in React.js, and thus a lot of teams is moving towards using JavaScript for testing as well, thus making a full end-to-end stack for automation. And it makes sense to also concentrate more on building up a better WebDriver library, and that's why we are actually deprecating Promise Manager and moving towards supporting the native support that JavaScript is giving us with the async await. So the benefits of WebDriver Promise Manager no longer outweighs the cost, given that we are actually removing it in favor of the native async await. So that's what we're going to talk about and see a couple of demos on how we can write the WebDriver test using async await. So way forward, how do we solve asynchronous and migrate off Promise Manager? So we saw callbacks, which is not good to use. You will get into a problem using callbacks when your tests eventually grow. And also with promise chaining, right? So promise chaining is actually classic. You can use it any way, anytime of the day, and don't worry about the Promise Manager, or don't worry about the async await structures, right? So it's always you can use, but with a lot of changes, like the big fat arrow that you saw. Earlier it was like a then function, now it's with the arrow functions. And then the main stuff that we're going to talk is async await. So now, promise chaining. So that's a little piece of code for you to look at. So with the use of promise chaining, we can achieve a code where you can use the thenable statements for the WebDriver. So this is not actually using the Selenium WebDriver testing module. So once we have the promise manager completely removed out of the code base, you can actually use the promise chaining by natively and achieve a synchronous way using the thenable statements. Next, the generators. I'm assuming a lot of people who use JavaScript will come across this already. generators is part of ES6. So what you can actually do is change each of your test functions to a generator and yield on a promise. But also to note that asynchronous generators are not currently supported natively, so you will have to use a library like task.js for this to work. But for people to have a smooth migration who has a lot of test suite built around the promise manager, who's heavily using the promises, you can actually have a smooth migration process by using Selenium WebDriver's promise manager, which is under the hood extending the generator behavior. So WebDriverJS with generators, so this is how it looks. So if you notice, we are actually using the testing module with test.before and test.8 and test.after. And also you can notice we have yield as a keyword before every WebDriver API calls. So what yield does is, yield blocks execution until the statement is done, right? Unlike, so if you use the then.function, which is nothing but you're actually resolving a promise, right? So with the latest ES6 generators, yield is nothing but it will actually resolve the promise and then it will block until the execution is done so that the next statement doesn't get executed before even that the current queue or the current task will get executed. Now, coming to async await. So async await is an ES 2016 language specification which is actually grabbed from C#. So async await is going to be solving all of your problems with callbacks, promise chaining, and the thenable statements. How does your code looks if you have to write your WebDriver code with async await? So all you have to do is write a JavaScript function with an async keyword and have all your WebDriver APIs followed by the await statement. So we just saw generators and also we just saw async await, right? So what's actually the difference between these? So await will call promise.resolve on the awaited value, whereas yield just yields the value outside the generator. And also, getting on to how do you use async await currently? Is it supported? Well, actually no, a couple of months back, but it was under the Harmony flag wherein you can use along with the node. But now, node version greater than 7.6.0, you have async await available and you can use it with no fast. And also, I know a lot of people in their work where the development team and you have a lot of Node.js server running, you might have a hard dependency that you have to use node version which is less than 7.6. So in that case, the most recommended way is to use Babel to transpile your code. So Babel is nothing but a transpiler which actually transpiles your older version of code into the newer version, and you can still be able to use the async await constructs. We'll have some async await demo. So the demo is going to be on the internet app, which is maintained by Dave Hyphener. So I'm assuming you know him. So he writes the Elemental Selenium blog, wherein all the scenarios with the code samples can be found in this repository. And I'm going to upload a file using async await construct using WebDriver. So is it visible all to this? No. Yeah, better? All right, so what I'm going to do is, so I'm under async examples folder, wherein I have a lot of subfolders, which is actually a different scenarios that I've developed as part of the internet app, like upload, download, frames, HTTP status, multiple windows. Don't get excited seeing HTTP status, which we'll get onto it later, which is still WebDriver own support HTTP status. All right, let's get into demo. First, let's into upload. So what's inside it? So if you look at that, inside the folder, I have a small project within itself. I have a README file, which eventually you will see in the repository. And node modules is the root library for the project, and then package.json is nothing but a file wherein you can download all the dependencies, which is like a POM Maven file in your Java world. And then the sum file.js is the file that I'm going to upload, and test is a folder where the Mocha test specs will be there, which Mocha will actually look in default. So I'm going to do npm test. Yeah, it was so quick so that you didn't see that. So if you look at the node version that I'm actually using 7.8.0. If you actually switch, I actually use NVM, Node Version Manager. So this is what I was talking about. If you have a hard dependencies that you have to use node version less than 7.6.user, so you can actually switch into NVM, Node Version Manager. It allows you to use different node versions on the same machine, and you can switch it as per you want. So when I do nvm ls, so these are different node versions that I have within my machine, right? So I have stable 7.8, 6.10, and so if I switch the node version, so it's just a simple command nvm use 6. So now is it the machine is actually using node version 6.10.1. Now if I try to run my test, it will show up an error, something like this. So what this means is that on my test, I have an async keyword, which I showed earlier in my slide. So the node version 6.10 is not able to understand the async keyword. So that's the problem with using the node earlier version. So you'll have to switch into node version 7.6.0 and higher to be able to use the async functions. So this is how the code looks like. Is it better? Yeah, so it's basically you have await before all the WebDriver APIs. If you look at the first test, nested frames, you have await driver.get, and then await driver.switch into frame. So I purposefully had this demo. Why? Because getting into frames and switching back and forth before the windows will be actually a problem when you actually work with promises. And with await, async and await, it makes it a lot easier in use. It's just that you use await in front of that. If it was earlier with using promise manager, you will just use driver.switch to.frame and then the frame top. That's it. But if you're using the thenable function way, you will actually write driver.switch to.frame, frame top, .thenof, and then you'll actually give a callback to it, right? So async await makes this a lot easier for us to write. So the deprecation plan, what does it look like? Phase 1, we allow users to opt out of the promise manager, which is actually completed. And then phase 2, opt into the promise manager, which is estimated to be October 2017, node 8. But one thing to be noted is that we are actually deprecating promise manager, but the code the full code, the 3,300 lines of promise manager code will still reside in the repository until the next two major Node version is going to be released, which is estimated to be October 2018 Node version 10. Until then, you can actually use Selenium Promise Manager environment variable to use it, and after that, it will no longer have any effect. So migration plan. You can actually disable the Promise Manager using the environment variable Selenium Promise Manager to 0, or using the Promise module and use Promise Manager to false. So you can actually migrate direct usage of managed promises. I know a lot of people who use directly a lot of Promise Manager APIs like the promise.resolve and promise.reject. So all you have to do is change all your promise.resolve into promise.fulfill, and likewise the same way the promise.reject. You just use promise.rejected. And if you want some more information about what it does under the hood, you can have a chat with me later after the talk, and I'm happy to explain and then completely migrate off the promise. And some miscellaneous tips. It's annoying to use await in all the statements, right? So how many of you like the code that I showed? Is it good to have await in all statements? Yeah. So, well, it's actually not required to have await in all the lines of the code. So why? Because there are a few APIs under the hood in the WebDriver JavaScript bindings that we actually send a resolved promise to the API itself. So which means that you should not have await statements. Say for example, it's the one that we have right in front of the screen, driver.find element, right? So the driver.find element will actually return a promise that's actually resolved. So it's not required to explicitly have an await keyword. Tip 2, wait for URL. So that's actually a HTTP module inside the WebDriverJS API. You can actually use wait for, it calls a URL for get request, and until it returns a 200 response. So I use quite a lot in my code wherein I have to wait for the application to be loaded, and this actually developed in a terms that we normally give a HTTP URL for our Selenium grid, right? HTTP localhost 444 WD hub. So which is actually referring to that. So it will wait for the server up to be ready and for our test to be actually get executed with no problems. And tip 3 is control flow. I was actually happy with using control flow a lot at my code base, is that, and also using the asynchronous stuff. So what the control flow does that you can actually have assert functions. So how many of you actually write assert statements within your code to make sure certain part of the web elements is actually available on your website? Quite a lot, right? So if you go into the Java or Ruby world, you will actually have different functions having asserts for different functions, right? So unlike if you come into the JavaScript world, it is quite easy to use control flow, and the flow.execute, what it does that it doesn't affect the actual flow that we're executing our test. So this actually happens parallelly, which means that we are actually saving a lot of time in it. And for those of you who is actually using the flow.execute, you can actually use the way which is mentioned right away using the await keyword. So what's new in WebDriverJS 3.0? As we were discussing, we are using the Selenium Promise Manager 0 flag for people to use, and we have the testing module within Selenium WebDriver with the generator support, and we are also working on quite a few W3 spec compliant changes. So I'm actually working on the actions classes, which is going to be part of W3 spec, and I'm quite excited about getting the W3 spec rolling out for the WebDriver. And some love for our siblings. WebDriver.io, right? I know a lot of people here use WebDriver.io instead of the official WebDriver.js. For those of you who are using WebDriver.io, it's not much of a concern for you because the WebDriver.io doesn't use the promise manager under the hood, so which means that they don't have to worry much about changing the code base itself. But still, if you want to use async await, you can use the way right on the screen, where value is equal to await browser.getValue, which is exactly the same what we use in the official WebDriver. But while you have to use this, you have to make sure you have the synchronous flag to be false on your config file in your WebDriver.io. Christian Broman is the maintainer for WebDriver.io. Should be here. If not, then you can find him on the Sauce Labs booth, so he should be there. And of course, WebDriver.io is by Sauce Labs. And the next most used third-party library is the intern.js, where we have intern 4 coming up with a lot of ES6 plus and TypeScript support. So if you see the highlighted text on the screen, which mentioned we have a lot of generator and async await support. The next is WD.js. It's a lot of libraries, right? Yeah. Long ago, we have a library called yield, which is nothing but, in generators, we saw the keyword yield, right? So it's nothing but they have yield plus WD is nothing but yield. Amazing, right? So yeah, so this crazy thing was developed by Jonathan Lips. So he's working at SauceLabs now, and the problem is that it's actually untouched for 3 years now, so it doesn't make sense to use. But under the hood, WD.js is actually using WD.io test runner, which will also be there as part of the promise. Next, APM. Yeah, so if you have to write APM test in JavaScript, how many of you write APM test in JavaScript? Yeah, cool. If you have to use async await, so this is how you do it. You have the normal capabilities and then a describe function. You have await driver create session with capabilities, and also the same with the current activity. And also we have Moise talking about rewriting the APM code base. We make sure you attend that so that you get to know what are all the changes we are doing as part of the APM code base itself, adopting into the async await. So by this, you can actually see that the whole JavaScript world is turning towards async await. So which means that if you write a lot of WebDriverJS code using Promise Manager, so it's a high time that you start converting your tests, slowly migrating into Promise Manager with generators as an option, or directly jump onto async await with a lot of code samples that I actually showed you. Likewise, the same is being done with APM. So APM has been there for a long time, but they're actually rewriting the whole code base using the APM async await. So there's a lot of examples available, not a lot, quite a few. On the official repository, we have an async await test, and then to Dave, as I mentioned, Dave has elemental Selenium tips. We have some. I've just raised a couple of pull requests on async await, the upload download stuff for you to actually download and use with it. And then the guys from Airware, they're doing a cool stuff. They actually adopted using async await and having a lot of success with that. You can also check it out. And yeah, that's it with my talk, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Any questions? I think Manoj may have covered everything. Okay, here's one.
Hi, I'm coming.
Got him.
Yes.
All right. So first of all, thanks for the talk. Mostly a Java guy, and we have been looking into JavaScript, protractor as such. Now, you talked about async await, and the problem we faced was we were using a lot of then statement to resolve promises. We used to check was whether the promise is resolved or not, like promise.resolve all, right? Now, you got a good point about async await, but I saw you were using async method in front of every function and await with terms of every line of code. Now, we don't want to do that. But you also mentioned something about like, you can take out the await from every statement, but that example wasn't a lot clear from my understanding. So if you could expand more on that, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of APIs where within the Promise Manager, we send in to the users that they don't have to explicitly resolve the promise. So namely, the one that I showed you on the example is directly using the driver.find element. So, and apart from that, you have a couple of other APIs like creating a WebDriver session using the builder class, and also some of the alert instances, right? So for all these APIs, you don't have to actually use the await statement, and you can directly use const with some name and then driver.findElement. And you don't have to, can actually get rid of the await statements. Does that answer the question?
Any more questions?
Are there any advantages of using the WebDriverJS official bindings over WebDriver.io or any other wrapper functions?
Of course, you get the official version, and if we go wrong, you can come to the Selenium conf and yell at us, and you have the, and also you're very welcome to send in pull requests, and it's just that official, right? So with Java, we are using the official, and you know that you're using the right version, and the same case with the JavaScript official bindings, that's it. And you have the native W3 spec, which is actually recommended by the W3, which is not the case with the other bindings. And also we have some other libraries like Nemo.js, which Matt is going to talk about, which is also under the hood using Promise Manager, and eventually they will also get onto it, which will be adopting to the W3 spec. Yep.
Right now we have a large pool of the test cases. I want to refactor them to be using the await. Do you have a efficient way to do the refactoring?
Well, as I mentioned in the migration plan, if you use a lot of Promise Manager APIs like promise.reject and resolve, you can actually migrate into the newer APIs that I mentioned, like fulfill, which under the hood uses a simple scheduler class, which is actually migrating off from the Promise Manager itself. And simple scheduler is nothing but a class which will actually have different tasks in it, and which will not use a Promise Manager. And after that, you can actually migrate into the using generators, but still using the testing module. And I know it's quite tough, but moving on to async await is one of the most recommended way to go forward. And with Promise Manager to generators, and from generators to async await, or maybe directly to async await. So whichever you feel based on the amount of tests that you have.
All right, well, I think we're just about out of time. We've got a 5-minute break, and then Meredith
Okay.
Lane will come up.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you much.